everyone, it's Dave. The other day I dropped a little short, quick note to you talking about some webinars and some stuff that we're doing to help everybody through this period, take your mind off of the crisis you're dealing with right now, hopefully give you something that can help you think about the future or work towards the future. I know it's a super uncertain time for everybody. And I think if you haven't listened to the Pivot podcast with Scott Galloway and Kara Swisher, Scott says all the time, he goes, the bad thing about crises is that they always come. The great thing is that they always end. And so I've been trying to do things and have things here for you that'll help you prepare for when the crisis ends. I know there's a lot of uncertainty. There's no clear timeline for folks. It's just, it's a tough situation all around. But I wanted to make sure I shared this conversation with you today with my friend Andy from the UK. Andy runs a company called We Are Wellbeing, and I wanted to have him on because they do a lot of things around mental health, physical health, and just overall well-being. Andy's a super great guy. This is a really interesting conversation. I think that from a mental health standpoint and just the ability to kind of gather your thoughts and rethink what's going on, it's a really helpful conversation. I hope that you enjoy it. And if you don't enjoy it, at least you find something that is helpful. I mean, I guess that's all that we can hope for today. As always, if you need me, you can email me, dave@davewakeman.com. You don't need any reason. You just want to talk to somebody, I'm here for you. So without anything else, here's Andy.
A test. I'm going to have a live conversation based on the sort of podcast format with my friend Andy Romero-Birbeck. He has a business called We Are Wellbeing, based in Leeds, and I wanted to talk to Andy about stress and mental health, the need to get exercise, the need to take breaks, fresh air, keep your perspective right, as we're all dealing with pretty much the entire world being shut down. And, a situation that unless we are, I guess it was 1918 was the last time something like this happened, unless we're well over 100 years old, we probably don't remember anything like this. So Andy, thank you for being here. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Yourself?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Under the circumstances, I'm completely holding it together. So I'm grateful for you to be here. I think this is going to be very valuable for people to hear.
No, it's good. It's good to be invited on, and obviously talking about stress and mental health and well-being. It's what we do. Now more than ever, it's people are being tested, and I think it's something that we really need to sort of reconnect with.
Yeah, I think we were talking about this before we started broadcasting, about the need for just mental health and well-being training and thinking about it just in general. And I think that this situation that we're dealing with has really accelerated the need for that. Let's say, I don't even want to throw in the normal times conversation, but I guess what kind of ideas or what would you say to people right now who are feeling a little bit unsure, maybe a little anxious, maybe confused? Because I think, and I think I know what your answer is going to be, but I think sometimes people don't necessarily, they maybe feel like they're in this thing alone.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, first of all, I think one of the things that we've got to consider is being able to we as a business, we talk a lot about our manageable health, the things that we've got some level of control over. Obviously, if somebody's got clinical anxiety and they do worry about things that are sort of potentially hypothetical, that might always happen. Obviously, I mean, like talking about myself, I don't suffer with anxiety, but I would say that there is definitely some level of worry and concern over the current situation. And I think to battle that and to be able to cope with that, it's about partly is looking at where you're getting your information from. I know if I go on Twitter or Facebook or any form of social media at the moment, I'm going to get bombarded with negative statistics, negative information related from absolutely anywhere in the world about the current situation. And I think the difficulty is everybody has become an overnight expert in coronavirus. Everyone's become an expert in mental health, and I don't know about where you guys are, but for us over in the UK, health and well-being is not regulated well enough. So people really don't know where to go for the best information, and I think that causes a lot of panic. So I think for me, as a well-being business, one of the things that we try and do is make sure that the people that we're working with, they're accessing valid information and they're getting the facts from reliable and credible sources. So that's probably the first thing. And then the other thing is coming back to basics and looking after your mental health. It doesn't necessarily need to be a really difficult thing. It can be just getting some of the really simple things right. We put out a webinar recently on self-care that was really well received, and it was just an honest and open talk about what are the simple things that we can do, and that might start with something simple like self-awareness. So to give you an example, one of the questions that we ask on any kind of sort of like mental health well-being training courses, are you open and honest to yourself about your own emotional state? And when we ask that question, especially if we're doing a live training course, it splits the room 50-50. You get half the people that sit there nodding in agreement that, yes, I am honest to myself about my own emotional state. But then the other half, usually all the guys in the room, sit there shaking their heads because they don't sit around thinking about their emotional state. Now, obviously, that has implications, as you can imagine.
Yeah, probably huge implications, right? And so, the audience here for the podcast is pretty split between men and women, and it's global, so it reaches people all over. But I'm going to guess guys are pretty much the same everywhere. What would you say to guys who, how do they become a little bit more aware of their emotional state and their mental state? How do you overcome that bias? Because as you were talking about it, I was like, I've been doing better of recognizing these things about myself, and about like if I'm feeling anxious or I'm feeling unsure or uncertain, that way I can deal with it. But how do you help people, or how would you coach someone to raise that awareness of themselves? Because it's not easy. I know that for sure.
It's not easy at all. And I think one of the things, first of all, before jumping on that, you've got to sort of address that some people are just not ready to talk.
Okay.
Some people are not ready to open up about it, and I think where some organisations get it wrong is where they push and they push and they push and they try and really push people to open up and talk. For some people, they'll really respond to that and it'll work really well, but for others, it just pushes them beyond engagement. But for me, what's worked.
Well, let me ask you, before you talk about how to make your awareness. How does somebody recognize whether or not they're ready to talk, or like how do you deal with that? Because I think that probably helps with the answer to the other question.
So first of all, when we talk about mental well-being and the support that's available out there, one of the things I'm not a mental health specialist, but what we do is we really empower people to offer that level of support by looking at three main things. One of them is spotting the signs. So what are the signs of struggling? So that, if you take a look at what we classify as neurotic mental ill health, so these are extreme versions of normal emotions. So you've got stress, you've got anxiety, you've got depression. It's highly likely all of us, if we live to a ripe old age, we will all experience some level of that. Because these are extreme versions of normal emotions, stress, anxiety, and depression. So extreme worry, extreme sadness, we're going to experience it. But it's about being able to recognize it internally. So I'll give you an example. So 2 weeks ago, we finished, the kids finished school because of coronavirus. They finished 2 weeks early and we started homeschooling. So on the second day, I wasn't mentally prepared and I absolutely broke down. I had a nightmare of a day. But for me, because I feel like I'm in a good state of mental health, I was able to recognize it. I was able to say, well, actually, you know what? This happened because of this, and I reacted badly because of this. And for me, I didn't act perfectly on that day, but I was able to recognize it probably because I talk about this kind of stuff a lot. But I think what blokes, what guys, what we need to be able to do is just identify what's the difference between a good day and a bad day. What are the things that contribute to a bad day? And if we're having too many bad days, we need to question ourselves. Why is this happening, or what's happening as a result of it? So once we've identified the signs, it's then having that conversation. And the conversation might come up in different ways. Now, for me, I've worked in health and wellbeing for years, and most of the people that do my job, a lot of the women that do my job are women. And why is that? Is it because women have high levels of empathy? Is it because they're better at talking? I don't know. But one of the things I've noticed about myself, and maybe why I think I'm good at what I do, is because when I start talking about mental health and well-being, I'm talking about it from a guy's perspective. So I think one of the best, in my experience, one of the best ways to get people talking is, without doubt, to share stories. Not me sitting here telling you all the facts and the stats around mental health and going over loads of theories, but actually sitting down and having an open conversation about, I felt this is how I felt. This is my personal experience, and we're kind of putting ourselves out there. And then what happens as a result of that, somebody in the room or somebody on the other side of the phone might say, you know what, I feel like that as well. And that might be the first thing that gets that conversation going. But it needs to be done. And usually that's the first sign. And then once somebody's started talking, then you might look at what the next step is. And the next step might be some sort of signposting, and signposting that person to their employee assistance program, or signposting to a counselor, or going to see their GP, their doctor. And that's usually the process.
Yeah, no, and the idea of first, that coming at it from a male standpoint is helpful, because I think that, and I know that probably in some way everybody needs some help here, but I think men do need it, and I think having stories is way more helpful for people than having statistics, because I don't know any of the statistics right off the top of my head, but I'm sure that they are probably not great for the number of people, men who regularly talk to somebody, who are self-aware of these things, know how to cope with things well. And I don't think those statistics are going to sway it. But even just so far, the conversation we've had, this idea of being able to label the way your day's going and helping you understand it, I mean, that rings true to me, and that's just a story. And I think that that's a very, very powerful way of explaining it to people, is like through the story, because then you can put yourself in, you can have empathy for yourself. I mean, maybe I'm wrong.
No, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there when we talk about empathy. I think everybody's got some level of empathy. Now, one of the things that I do as a business, what we do is what we specialize in is manager training. So training managers on how to look after the well-being of their teams. And the reason where I'm particularly passionate about that is I saw a post on social media probably about a year ago, and it just said, employees don't leave bad companies, employees leave bad managers. And I thought, is there something in that? So whenever I go to a new organization, I'll ask that question, and resoundingly, people just agree with it. Because I think a lot of people know somebody, if they've not experienced it themselves, have left a company because of a bad manager. So there's that question. And then the next question I have is, well, most companies don't provide any coaching, any insight, or any training for the manager not to be a bad manager. It's sort of like when people become managers within an organization because they were good at the job that they did, not because they've got high levels of empathy. So then, but then it's the year's 2020 now. Should we be asking ourselves the question: should having some level of empathy and caring about other people be a core competency of being a good manager? And personally, I think it should be.
Oh, I would agree 100%. And, in the way that you talk about telling stories, a story that I use all the time about this example that you just used of you got promoted because of your ability to do the job, not because you were a good manager. When early in my career, that happened to me. I was extremely successful at marketing and selling and building partnerships, which led me to get a series of promotions and new roles and new responsibilities. and I was completely ill-equipped to be a manager at that point. And so, like, I had absolutely no empathy for folks. I had absolutely no concern for people's mental well-being. I checked all of those boxes, and to add to it, I lacked all self-awareness at all. So, I check every one of those boxes you're talking about, and I'm certain that if we highlight these, if people recognize these things, you can change them, because took deep self-reflection on my behalf to realize all those things about myself, and it wasn't easy. And I think that's one of the, at least, and I'm curious about this. I think that's one of the challenges a lot of people struggle with, because they don't necessarily. They think it comes easy for people, and they don't realize the level of work that goes into this.
Well, I think what happens is part of that is building on your own personal level of resilience. And I know, like, when I was 21 and I just finished university and I got my first job, I was working for a big private healthcare company, and I'd never really experienced anything before. So for me, having, like you say, having that level of empathy, having that emotional connection to other people, it wasn't really there, and I didn't really understand other people's struggles. But then, 16 years down the line, or sort of 15 years down the line, I've experienced a lot more than I had done when I was 21. So that level of empathy, that level of personal levels of resilience, and understanding of human nature, it changes. It grows within us, and I think that allows us to become better at what we do, and better at looking after the well-being of other people as well. And I think what happens is one of the things that I've seen happen especially within organizations, is we can take the hardest guy in the room, the guy that turns up with his arms crossed, who's not bought into the ideology of well-being whatsoever. Actually, by the end of the day, he's the guy that holds on behind everybody else to come and shake my hand to say thank you, because we've totally turned him 360. And that's the guy that came in with sort of skepticism and leaves with a want and a need and an interest to go and help his people. And to have a job where we can do something like that is why we do what we do.
Yeah, and I know a lot of it is societal, right? Because you're in the UK, I'm in the US. There is a vision of leadership, right? Which is, you need to stiff upper lip, and and there's that and then there's the other side, which is like the servant leadership. And I think, we're talking, we're dealing with the coronavirus, and I think that where I've started to come down on these things. And again, I'm going to be curious what you have to say about this, is that it doesn't have to be either or. You don't have to be stiff upper lip and no emotional intelligence at all, and you don't have to be complete lovey-dovey, hippy-dippy, right? There's a difference. You can be somewhere in the middle, because I think the key attribute is, like, you have to care about people to be a good leader. You have to really love people, at least in my opinion. But at the same time, you can never lose sight of the fact that, like, I love people, and the best thing I can do for them sometimes is make a decision, and to push people forward, because that's what I'm there for. But I'm curious of what your take is on this.
Yeah, 100% with you on that. So we talk
not planned at all.
we talk about like personality types. So like, you can do all these different sort of personality diagnostics. You could do like extreme type A's are really competitive and they'll cutthroat and they'll win at all costs, and then you've got extreme type B's that are really sort of relaxed, and they they don't adhere to high pressure and performance, so they're pretty chilled out, and they're more like to have a low pressure job. And really, as a leader, you don't want either of those, because the cutthroat type A will just walk all over everybody and leave their emotions in tatters. But then the extreme type B will, you don't really want them running your business, because they're not high performers. So so what we find is usually you need a bit of a mix of the two. So you want sort of like a type A, type B personality. And I know from my experience of being employed years ago, was I've had managers that were an extreme type B that wanted to be everybody's friend, and they were really caring, and they were a good laugh, and everybody liked them, but nobody had any respect for them. And then on the flip side, I've had managers that have just you'd feel intimidated going and knocking the door and having and talking to them, and ruling with a fear factor. But ultimately, people don't like working for them. So it's finding that fine balance between the two. So, but I think it's in there somewhere. And quite often we'll go into organizations where we've got let's call it old school managers that have been managing for 40 years. And then I turn up, a 35-year-old guy talking to them about well-being. And it's a tough crowd to try and change their mind and get them thinking about some of this stuff, some of these new concepts. And
when you're talking about that too, like you go in and people are kind of set in their ways, how much of that is generational, and how much of it is just, depends on your sex, and then how much of it is generational.
Yeah, I think some of it's generational. I think some of it's demographic as well, depending on where you live and the type of environment that you grew up in. Obviously in the UK we're a small island, but from city to city the cultures are massively different. So if I'm down in London, people are pretty open to some of the newer concepts. But if I go out somewhere that's more sort of manual labour, more of a guy's heavily male atmosphere, then it's harder to engage with. But I think that's where we're particularly good at what we do, because being a guy myself, I go to the gym, I lift some weights, I play sports, I do all the rest of it. I go to the pub and have a few pints. So all those things, I feel it's important to have someone you can relate to. Now, so it is part generational, but I think there's a lot of other contributing factors as well, because some of the most caring people, some of the people that buy into this the most are some of the older generation.
Okay.
Some of the guys
sorry. And I was going to say too, at least I like to, I guess, let me back it up. I like to think of myself too as like being like extremely an avid watcher of people. Like I love to watch people. That's why I love the huge cities, like so London and New York, Hong Kong, because there's just, you come across so many people. And Mike, I guess the question I want to ask you is in your work, probably a lot of times some of the people who embrace these ideas the most would be the people you would see that would ultimately seem the least likely. And what I mean by that is like you talking about some of the blue collar areas and like some of the people where they're working with their hands and like working in factories and doing all these things. At least in my experience of like watching and talking to people and understanding people, sometimes you find the greatest practitioners of, empathy and emotional support and being, kind of tuned into other people are these people that you wouldn't expect, so I'm curious about, this from your perspective.
Yeah, I think what happened. Well, in my experience, one of the things that we see is you go into, let's say, a production company where people are working on, they've got a manual labor job, you're working hard, long hours, and the person that there's a bit of strategy behind this, because one of the people I know that when I go into an organization like that, they're probably never experienced well-being before, because still there's a lot of organizations that are not doing anything. So when we go in, it can be quite a new concept. But what will happen is we'll go and find the loudest, the joker of the pack, the person that is sort of like the patriarch of the business, but on the ground level. And when you get those guys bought in, a lot of it's bravado, and they'll be talking, they'll be having a laugh, and they'll be taking making jokes out of the colleagues and the rest of it, and quite loud and brash. But they're the guys that buy into it. They're the guys that actually are really caring and are really likely to support their teams. And I think this whole thing, like, when I was growing up, it was whole thing like, your boys don't cry, man up was a phrase that we use a lot over in England. Man up, sort yourself out. and that's massively starting to change now, and it's quite exciting to be living in a world where that's becoming unacceptable. Because then, you know, I think, especially from a blokey point of view, the way that we hit it, and I think one of the reasons why it's becoming more acceptable for guys to talk and to open up, and a lot of the guys that were probably less likely to open up are starting to open up, is because we've all had some sort of experience. I mean, the stats in the UK are 1 in 4 of us will experience some sort of mental health crisis in any given year. And I mean, to get deep on you, I've got so 6 years ago, I didn't know anybody at all that was affected by suicide. So I didn't know anybody. So no close friends, didn't know anybody at all. And in the last 6 years, 3 of my friends have all died by suicide. So when I go into an organization and can talk about these stories, not that I use those as a selling point, but it's a real story. It's something that, you know, these things happened. And I open up about something like that, I guarantee most people in the room know somebody else that has had this experience. And, you know, 10 years ago, that wouldn't have happened. Those conversations weren't happening. Whereas now, you guarantee everybody in the room knows somebody that's been affected by some serious form of mental illness. I don't know if it's the same, you know, what your thoughts are over in the States, if that's a similar sort of situation.
I would say early on when we were talking, you talked about, you know, the mental health not being necessarily as well regulated in the UK as you think it should be. And I would say that that's even more true in the States. And when you said 1 in 4 people have some sort of severe emotional or mental event each year, and they deal with one of these things like anxiety or stress or depression, I would say that number is low. You know, it sounds low in the States to me. I mean, you know, I don't think I don't have like a clinical diagnosis, but these are things that, you know, like stress, I think every one of us deals with it. And one thing we were talking about before was like good stress versus bad stress, but like the negative stress, you know, and I know, I mean, I've been anxious due to the coronavirus thing, right? Because it's like really, really uncertain. And depression, I think, you know, I mean, I think all of these things, you know, if I'm being honest with myself, at some point I touch on, or like they impact me in some way. And I can't imagine that I'm unique, right? if anything, probably far from it. So I would say that those numbers are probably even more, you know, higher in the States, because I don't think we even have come as far as you have, as far as a culture of discussing these kind of things.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think one of the things, I mean, whenever we come over to the States, you know, myself and my wife and my girls, we come over, you know, a couple of times a year. And one of the things that, you know, you notice about people, you know, Americans, is they're pretty open. You know, people sit down and, you know, you sit down, you say hello, you say good morning, you talk about your day, you talk about, you know, where are you guys from? And that's one of the things that social aspect of well-being, what I love about coming over to America. And you go to you go to London. If you look at somebody, if you try and make eye contact with somebody, you know, walking through the park, they think you're mad. So I think, you know, for you guys, I don't know how open you are compared to us. I wouldn't have a clue. I think it's, for us as a country, we're probably getting better at it. These conversations are becoming more normal. But I think we're still miles off. We're getting there. We're doing better than we were, but we're still way off where we need to be. And I think coming back from coronavirus, there's going to be a sort of like a financial situation. Obviously, a lot of organizations are going bust. So I think there's going to be a lot of financial pressure on people. And that'll be a big trigger for mental ill health. But I think generally there's going to be a big mental health crisis off the back of this. And already before coronavirus hit, those measures and those support mechanisms over here in the UK were already stretched. I know I've personally recommended people to go to the GP and then get to their family doctor and go get a referral to a psychologist, and the waiting list is like six to 8 weeks. And that was pre-coronavirus. So imagine all the people that are struggling psychologically after this has happened, and we start trying to return to normal. I think it's going to be another crisis. But I think part of that is where we come in is showing people what they can do for themselves. How can you safeguard yourself? How can you look after yourself? And a lot of it starts with some of the really simple things. So it's yeah.
And I was going to say too, and you tell me if I'm wrong too. It's like, so something like what you focus on, it's what you can do for yourself. But I think, and tell me if I'm wrong. It's also the things that you can do for that group of people that you influence and you impact, right? So it might be the 5 or 6 people on your team, because that can have it can relieve a lot of pressure as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, absolutely. Well, so when we talk to organizations about well-being, I had a conversation earlier this morning with a company, and there needs to be some level of strategy there to understand how can you engage with the wider audience. So one of the things that we talk about is the responsibility of well-being within a business. So first thing is, what's the responsibility of the organization? What are the fundamental things an organization should do to ensure the well-being of its people? And that might be simple things like having a policy. Do we have a well-being or a mental health policy? And most organizations don't have a policy around mental health or well-being. They might have a health and safety policy, but not necessarily a well-being policy. And then it might be, do they facilitate well-being? Do they make it so people can come to work and leave work as healthy as they were when they arrived? So, simple concepts, but, it could take a while, right? So that's the first one. Then the second area of responsibility is looking at management. So as a line manager, what should you be doing? So if I manage a small team, so do I have some level of responsibility to look after the people that work for me? Do I need to be checking in on them? Do I need to have a well-being one-to-one? Do I need to do a health and safety, a well-being risk assessment if I start to notice some of the things that are not quite right? But then on a personal level, as an individual employee, what is their responsibility? Now, this is where we come back to manageable health. And the whole thing about your manageable health is if you don't manage it, it becomes unmanageable. So what can we do? What can you do, Dave? What can I do to look after our personal well-being? And this is where we come back to basics. It's things like making sure that you get a good night's sleep, or doing your best to have a good night's sleep. Making sure that you're consuming good food and nutritious food that's going to provide your body with a good immune system, provide you with lots of energy to be able to do the things that you do. From a psychological point of view, it's having some self-awareness, looking after, being able to talk to people, getting some physical exercise. So we know that physical exercise has been sort of proven to be have a very similar impact on mental health as taking antidepressants, and that's been clinically proven. So we know that we don't just have to rely on medication and drugs to get us through it. There's a lot of things that we can do just off our own back, and I think that's where, as individuals, as human beings, we've got to step up and take a little bit of responsibility for ourselves.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on this idea of exercise because it's like a super drug. Because if you I just go that I want to tell people that the runner's high thing is real, and I know that one of the things that people can do while we're in this period is they can take breaks and get outside. And I would encourage people to do it because for a day or two, it was raining here and I couldn't get outside and I was like losing my mind. And then yesterday I took a walk outside because the weather broke. If you can do it, get outside, even if it's just for 15 minutes and walking around the block. My doctor said completely that it's safe to do it. It's probably, as long as you keep social distance from people. So, I totally would encourage people to do that as much as they possibly
Absolutely. Can. And I think a lot of people get worried about or concerned about the idea of being physically active. And a lot of people have this association that physical activity has to be exercise. And it's rubbish. It doesn't, that's not the case. Physical activity, it can be going out and do some gardening. It can be cleaning the house. I've got a funny story. Years ago, I did some health checks for a company, and one of the tests that we used to do was what we call a VO2 max fitness test. And the VO2 max test gives you like a prediction of your cardiovascular capabilities. And the lady, one of the women that worked at the organization in question, she was the receptionist, and her fitness score was far superior to everybody else's. So when I was asking her why is it that your fitness score is far, better than the guy that does the triathlons, better than the guy that does all these running events, and her answer was she used to clean the house to music. So she put on some music, and she'd dance around, and she'd do the vacuuming, she'd do the dusting, and she'd do all the things all just to music, and she'd work up a sweat. But she did it on a daily basis, and it kept her fit and well. So she didn't pay for an expensive gym membership. She didn't go running. She didn't have the fancy trainers, but she danced to music and cleaned the house. So it can be absolutely anything. It doesn't have to be a scheduled exercise regime that many think it might be.
And I would say that nobody wants to. I would totally dance to music while I am sleeping or doing housework. I don't want anybody to come looking in my mirror, my windows, because nobody wants to see that. So.
You're allowed to draw the curtains. You don't have to do it.
But yeah, I tell you, my stepfather, he gave me an extreme one, and maybe this is maybe I've gotten off topic here with this one, but he told me one of the greatest things you can do for yourself is to get a great stereo system, and I think that I've noticed that as well. It's like it doesn't even have to be happy music or it because I've listened to some sad songs, but they have helped a lot while we've been in this thing. It's I think music helps as well. I guess like one question I would ask you though is, because I had this question before, and I think I mentioned it even on Twitter or when I was promoting our conversation, was sleep, especially in like keeping a schedule and like dealing with it, because it seems like a lot of people are struggling with their sleep right now. I know I will be tired a lot of the day, and then when it comes, typically I am pretty good about going to bed somewhere between 10:30 and 11:30 every night for forever now, almost. And I really struggle now. And from my conversations with folks, a lot of people are having that challenge. How can people, what can people do to make sure their schedules sort of consistent, or help keep get good sleep right now?
So when we talk about sleep hygiene, one of the things that we try and keep this as simple as we can do. Now I'll give you kind of my example. So I'm a father. I've got two girls. I've got a 7-year-old and I've got a 5-year-old. Now for the kids growing up, the thing that's been fundamental to our happiness has been the kids' sleep routine. Now, if the kids don't, say for instance, if I say to the kids tonight, look, you can watch some Netflix, you can go to bed at 9 o'clock, you can, do whatever you want. I guarantee that they will have a terrible night's sleep. They'll probably get into our bed. They'll wake up the next morning in a bad mood. But then on the flip side, if I make sure that they have a bedtime routine, if we feel like, 7 p.m. you're going to take a bath. We're going to get you dressed. We're going to read you a bedtime story. I'm going to give you a kiss goodnight. We put all those things together. Excuse me, someone's trying to FaceTime me.
This is live podcasting.
All those things together, and you guarantee that the sleep will be disrupted. So, one of the best tips I would have from a well-being perspective and a sleep perspective is to build a bedtime routine. So that might start, first of all, is looking at your stimulants. So when we talk about stimulants, three of the main stimulants would be light exposure. So, artificial light, screen time, devices, all those things. Then the next one would be stress. So how much stress are we under? And then the third one would be caffeine, and how much caffeine are we consuming. And if we can limit those things as best we can to earlier on in the day, that'll help us somewhat. But then part of the next thing is doing something that will actively help us to relax and actively help us to wind down. So when we talk about the stress balance, when we get stressed, we get an increase in the fight or flight response. So what we call the sympathetic nervous signal, where adrenaline and cortisol, the stress hormone, and heart rate and blood pressure and respiratory rate, all those things will become elevated. But we don't want that to happen when we're trying to go to sleep. So what we need to do is stimulate the opposite. And the opposite of the fight or flight is what we call the rest and digest. And the rest and digest is something that what can we actively do that will lower heart rate, lower blood pressure, lower adrenaline levels and lower cortisol levels and respiratory, and bring all those things back down again. So it's about what can we identify that will do that. Now, for me, that's practicing mindfulness. So I don't know what's your mindfulness knowledge like, Dave?
I would say probably I like to think better than average.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So to give an idea then, so mindfulness is a bit like meditation, but without the religious context. It's about being able to focus on something tangible and reconnecting with your senses. So one of the ways that, I know personally where my sleep is disrupted is trying to get to sleep, and I will I'll have an active mind. So if I'm because I'm self-employed, constantly thinking about business ideas and new ways of developing the business. And if I lay in bed thinking about that, there's no chance I'm going to get to sleep. So what I personally do is I listen to an app called Headspace.
Okay.
And Headspace is like a guided relaxation. And I listen to that, and it's so boring. It's on for about 45 minutes, but it's so boring. I like a light. And I listen to what it's saying. I do the controlled breathing. I do all those simple things. And yeah, it knocks me out, and it's brilliant. It works a treat.
I like the way we're selling Headspace. It's so boring, it'll knock you out.
You know what though? I love Headspace. It works, and that's the personal one that works for me. But obviously there's different versions. There's one called Calm. There's free ones on YouTube. There's loads. It should be accessible to absolutely everybody. But then a simple way of doing it is just focusing on your breathing. So laying in bed, getting relaxed, getting comfortable, and just focusing on your breath. And I think not only is that good for stimulating the parasympathetic nervous signal and enabling us to sleep, it's a great coping strategy for daytime stress as well. So being able to kind of, retune that balance, if you like. So yeah, so for sleep, it's definitely without a doubt building a bedtime routine.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. And, I know both of us are going to have kids that knocking on our doors any second. I want to bring up one more thing here. It fits right in here because you talked about food and diet. And I'll share with everybody, maybe the greatest thing that I've done for myself as far as like managing my stress, helping with my self-awareness, just kind of managing some of these things is I changed my diet a little bit about the middle of last year because I had an issue with a thyroid issue. And the doctor was like, well, hey, if you try like a lower carb thing, right? And I cut out the sugars and grains from my diet. And it's, I'm not 100%, not even close, but I'm probably 90% most of the time where I avoid all that stuff. And when I'm consistent about it, it helps a lot. Do you have any tips as far as diet goes that you can offer people on top of that? Because I will, if not, I have tons of resources that I'm happy to share with anybody listening to this.
Yeah, I think with nutrition, because it's such a huge subject, and because you can go out there, you can look at really valid research papers that will completely contradict each other. Most people out there on a nutritional format don't know which way to turn. And what works for you might not work for me, and vice versa. So, for example, personally, I do intermittent fasting.
Okay.
So I don't eat breakfast like a king, and I don't set my day up with a big breakfast. I personally like to fast until about midday, and I'll stop eating at 8 o'clock on an evening. And that allows me to I feel like that regulates my body really well to manage what I do, and it helps me to control my diet. But it's not sort of exclusive of or inclusive of certain things. I think from a nutrition standpoint, you've got to be really sort of careful on sort of like the recommendations that we give, because even in the UK, there's hard and fast guidelines from the UK government on what people should do for a healthy diet. And I know for a fact most clinical nutritionists would disagree with most of it. Because
that makes sense.
and I think what the government recommend is actually not necessarily what most professional nutritionists would recommend. But every nutritionist that I know recommends completely different things. So I think it's really a bit of a journey of discovery when it comes to nutrition. It's finding out what personally works for you. And like I said, I found intermittent fasting works well for me. I think one thing that we've kind of come out of is, which was really popular in the 90s, was fad diets.
Yep.
People seem to be, wised up a little bit more. So usually when we talk about fad diets, kind of my sort of rule of fad diets is if it excludes a whole food group, if it promises miracle results, and if it's unsustainable, and if it's endorsed by a celebrity, it's probably a fad.
But I think those are pretty good rules to live by.
So otherwise, but I think everything goes. And like you said, like if that's worked for you and you feel better on that, fantastic. And obviously there's things people can do to really discover more about it from a nutritional standpoint. But my recommendation is, I always signpost to our nutritionist, because it should be a really specialized area. But like we said right at the beginning of the podcast, nutrition and health and well-being is not very well regulated.
Right.
So I've personally got a baseline nutrition qualification, so I could call myself Andy the nutritionist, but I'm not.
Yeah, it's definitely, mental health, nutrition, all of these things, they probably need to be paid a lot more attention. And I think probably there needs to be some, I don't want to say regulation, but like a little bit more consistency about what's expected, what's needed for people, I think is probably the right way. And give people a little more clarity, because I think, as we talked about here, there's so much gray area that it makes it really difficult for people to know where to turn for the right advice and the right ideas. And it really is a challenge for folks.
It is, and that's partly what we're trying to do as a business. I mean, pre-coronavirus, we were going into organizations delivering in-person seminars and training on all these specialist areas. So what we've tried to do now is be a bit more responsive and open up all the content that we have and access to our experts via webinars. So that's what we're pushing at the moment is global access to a sit down webinar with a qualified registered nutritionist for nutrition, and a qualified a clinical psychologist talking about mental health, and an exercise physiologist talking about the benefits of exercise. And it's really getting people who otherwise wouldn't have access to those professionals to be able to sit down and listen to some fact-based, evidence-based recommendations.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, I think all this stuff and the stuff you're working on is great. I think there was a lot here for people to learn about. For the people who can't see the slide, who are listening to this on the podcast, how can people find you, Andy?
So obviously we are on, so the website is wearewellbeing.co.uk, being a UK-based business. So you can check us out on there. Obviously we're on Twitter, so it's at WA Wellbeing, and we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook. So if you search for We Are Wellbeing, you'll come across us. So yeah, if anybody's got any questions, if you want a bit of advice, feel free to get in touch.
Yeah, and I would encourage it. I include a lot of the resources in my newsletters and the stuff I promote, because I think it's really, it's always the right time to focus on making sure your head's in the right space, and that you're taking care of yourself. So, Andy, I thanks so much for doing this.
No problem. Well, Dave, thanks for having us. Good to catch up.
All right.